Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Joti Brar. We're going to talk about all of these countries who, coincidentally, their economies are crashing or have crashed, and they seem to be screaming for war at the same time. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are hanging out with Joti Brar on a Tuesday morning. And here's what we're going to discuss today: interesting phenomenons, and see if Joti can philosophically put this stuff together. And that is, so recently, three things have happened. Merz, so this guy screaming like a Nazi, if I ever heard one. The Russians are being Russian, and we got to put a stop to that. Meanwhile, you've got Starmer, a very interesting fellow who. This guy's really weird, but at any rate, just a strange character, to say the least, who doesn't seem to have a grip on the reality of politics in Great Britain. In that, the people are furious. His own party seems like they're ready to kick him to the curb. He just ignores it and instead says we must build a great military so we can go up against Russia. And of course, Pete Hegseth, who is the Pentagon, Minister of War, you might as well call him, for the United States. And he gave a speech recently, which was screeching for war with China. And it was basically saying everything backwards. We don't want war with China, but we do. We're not going to have a war with China. That would be terrible. But we're getting ready for one. We're surrounded China with missiles and bases, and we're getting ready to fight China, but we're not. It was just madness. At any rate, so Joti, something you've discussed before. But what's going on now, this combination of things, and it's it's like, I would say World War III, if it wasn't for the fact that World War II never really ended. Joti, can you make some sense of this madness?
I'll try, Garland. I watched the speech of Pete Hegseth. You very kindly sent a link to me, so I went off and watched the whole thing. It was quite horrific. As you said, it was a really a classic example of what Orwell, the great anti-communist writer, but he coined some good terms, and he coined this term newspeak and doublespeak, and it was a real, black is white, good is bad, truth is lie kind of a speech, wasn't it? As you said, it turned the whole world upside down. We're looking for peace through strength, is what Pete Hegseth said. Now, this is a really interesting combination of words, isn't it? This phrase, where does it come from? The truth is, as a meaningful slogan, peace through strength is the posture of the socialist and anti-imperialist world when they are faced with aggressive, rampant imperialism on their borders, on their doorstep, trying constantly to undermine them and bring them down. So they are forced into a situation, not of their making, of having to invest very heavily in armed forces and armaments to have a very strong self-defense posture in order to stop the constant attempts of the imperialists to destroy their countries. Let us not forget, right at the end of World War II, Winston Churchill was pushing hard for Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable being rearm the Nazis who we just defeated, well, the Soviets defeated. We're ready to rearm them and point them at Russia and back them up with nuclear bombs on a load of Soviet cities. That was Winston Churchill's plan for really ending World War II. That's how he wanted it to end. He couldn't get away with it for a multitude of reasons, but the biggest one actually being the fact that the masses of the world would absolutely not have worn it. He would have just accelerated the revolution he was trying to stop. So this is the reality. The socialist and anti-imperialist countries have always been forced into a position of having to defend themselves by having a strong military force and a strong military capability and a strong deterrent. We have a classic example of that in the post-Soviet period of the DPRK, North Korea's nuclear weapons. Do we remember? I can't remember who was asked now. Maybe it was Hillary Clinton, one of the bigwigs in one of the US administrations during the kind of 2000s, basically admitted that, yes, if Iraq had kept its nuclear program and Libya had the way that North Korea did, it would have been, they probably wouldn't have been able to make the war that they made, right? And that the only reason they hadn't waged the same type of war against the DPRK was because it had that nuclear deterrent, had the ability to hit them back hard, right? So this is the truth of what this, where this slogan really comes from and where it makes some sense. Peace through strength is the position of, for example, North Korea. We want peace. How do we get it? How do we guarantee a peaceful existence for our people? We are very, very strong and we will not back down, and we arm ourselves as highly as possible with the latest technology in our armaments to make sure that the cost of attacking us is just too high for the USA to bear, right? That's what that slogan really means. What does it mean when Pete Hegseth says it? Who is threatening the USA? They run around the world, these imperialists, screaming about threats and how we have to respond to the threats by beefing up our military and preparing for war. We want peace, but we have to prepare for war. But who is it who's threatening global peace? Who is it who stops there being peace ever for one single day? It's the imperialists. The biggest warmonger on the planet is the USA. For the US government to run around the world saying we have to protect peace with our strength when they're putting their aggressive bases and aggressive forces and funding proxy wars all over the world and forcing the whole world into this massive conflagration. It's truly bizarre, isn't it? And it really relies on what you see with so much of Western politics these days is they do everything possible to keep their own people in a state of total ignorance. And then they just manipulate them with catchphrases and emotive kind of language and culture wars. And everything is about distraction and division and confusion rather than any kind of genuine attempt to help the people, educate the people, be on the same side as the people. You know, the reality is the people in the White House or the people in Downing Street or the people occupying the Élysée or the Brussels Parliament, whatever, these people are hired servants of a class whose interests are not just opposed to the interests of countries around the world like Russia, China, Iran, DPRK, most of the world, but actually whose interests are totally opposed to those of their own people. And to try to hide this, they have to keep their people as ignorant as possible and as manipulated and kind of emotionally confused as possible. And really, I think when you look at the government and the rhetoric that comes out of the USA now, the Trump era of doing politics, it's the pinnacle of that kind of, it's a decaying system that can't represent itself as anything sane anymore. So it just literally has to resort to, on the one hand, at home, playing up the culture wars as much as possible to just keep people like fighting like rats in a sack, and abroad, just posturing as this big bully boy and desperately trying to keep the rest of the world convinced, even though the evidence of their eyes is telling them the opposite now, that they're still the biggest show in town. You still have to be on board with us. You still have to either follow us or be afraid of us because we can destroy you, we can wipe you out. I mean, I even heard Scott Ritter talking to Professor Morandi a while back about Iran. And Scott said something that kind of disturbed me because it was such an echo of the way that the White House speaks, which was, if the USA really wanted to hurt Iran, it would be a country-destroying event. And there's nothing, it basically saying, the power of the US is so much that even though the US is wrong and Iran is right, Iran should disarm now, because if you don't, look what's coming for you. I'm trying to hold these people back, but they're mad. And that's kind of the way the whole US regime operates these days. This like, well, I'm trying to hold them back, but they're mad. It's very much like a kind of Mafia Shakedown, or a good cop, bad cop routine, where you just really try to keep this idea going, this fear in the people of the world that if you put up resistance, if you try to be sovereign, if you try to be independent, if you try to determine your own destiny, there's no holding these crazy US people back, and they're so strong they'll just obliterate you. But the problem is they can't live up to their words. What happened just a few weeks ago when Donald Trump and his cabinet were screaming about how they were going to obliterate the Houthis? What happened? How many weeks did it take for mainstream US press to admit that they'd spent a load of money, destroyed a load of equipment? They couldn't affect any serious military target, but the Ansarallah, the Yemenis, kept hitting them, bringing down their drones, bringing down their fighter jets, hitting their aircraft carriers, and they had to run away. And Trump shouted that this was a victory, but the truth was it's a massive defeat. Now, it might be possible for a lot of citizens of the USA to be oblivious to that fact, but it's not possible for the leaders of countries all around the world to be oblivious to that fact. All right. So you've got this very tricky situation for the imperialists. Now, we've talked about this before, right? But we have to take a step back and say, why are they so desperate all the time to go to war? Why is it? And you said right at the beginning there, imperialism is crashing. The economies are crashing. And yet what they want to do is ramp up military spending. And on one level, as a human being, when you think, well, there's this much money and how are you going to spend it? It seems balmy, doesn't it? You're like, well, the economy is in tatters. We've got, I know in Britain, and I'm sure in the States it's the same, and across Europe, a massive poverty crisis, which is growing all the time. Huge numbers of our children now go to school hungry. Their parents can't even afford for them. It actually costs a lot of money to pay for everything a child needs to go to a state school, never mind a private school. And increasing numbers of families simply can't afford to facilitate their children to actually properly take part in their education. They can't afford school lunches, they can't afford the school uniform, they can't afford all the little extras you have to pay to join in with things. So the kids don't have proper homes, they don't have proper meals, they don't have a proper education. There's a massive poverty crisis growing, and many of these kids, in fact, the majority of them, are in families where at least one parent works, right? So it's not even like in the old days where this is because everybody's unemployed. It's just that employment actually doesn't pay wages that really sustain a family. So we have this poverty crisis. And we have decaying industrial landscapes in the West. We have a real lack of meaningful employment. All the employment is low wage, service sector, or logistics, very little in industrial manufacture or anything that really makes new wealth or makes people feel like they're doing something that's useful. The most useful jobs now in the West are delivering services to other people, and those are being cut back to the point where they're very depressing fields to work in because you can't really deliver the service you want to deliver. If you're a teacher, if you're a nurse or doctor, if you're a social care worker, you're not really able to deliver the skill, the care that you were trained to deliver, or the education. So it's demoralizing to be trying to do that in a system that's being starved of funds. So, and yet we're always being asked for more tax because the government says it can't meet all its bills. So where's all the money going, right? The money's going on trying to bail out big business and subsidize their profit margins, which are constantly shrinking because the whole system is in a massive global crisis. It's a crisis of capitalist production, and it's on a global scale. And this is the secret of why they want war. They need war to balance the books, i.e., they need a massive cash injection that they can only get from selling armaments, selling reconstruction of things they destroy, and looting countries that they conquer. And in particular, Russia and China are their targets, because Russia and China stand in the way of their continued domination of the globe. Because they're big, because they're able to be independent, because they both had development on a socialist basis that gave them military parity with the West. And they have technological parity that enables them to help other countries as well as themselves. And all of that gets in the way of the imperialists doing what they want to do to try to solve their crisis, which is just loot harder. And also, you know, what we're seeing with Russia and with China today is whilst they both, well, Russia's been stopped from doing business with the West, but before it was happy to do business with the West. China's been doing business with the West for decades, but on its own terms, not on the terms of total looting that the imperialists need in order to give an injection, you know, back to their flailing system. So you have this, what can look like a very strange setup. You know, we see a lot of people in the West will put forward this slogan, welfare, not warfare, by which presumably they mean we should pay for social services and not for weapons. But the problem is, if you don't look at the system as a whole, this doesn't make any sense, because in the West, our welfare was paid for by imperialist looting of the world, right? If you want to have good social services and social security and a decent level of existence for the workers in the West without war, you have to have socialism. You're not going to get it from saying, oh, well, we just slash the war budget, because the war budget is what keeps the capitalists going, right? And it keeps them being imperialists. It keeps them being able to give a bit of a kickback to the workers at home. But what we're seeing today is that the number of people they can give a kickback to is shrinking massively. And that's causing huge social problems at home, which is why you come back to this kind of distract, divide model in Pete Hegseth's speech. And we've seen the same with Keir Starmer recently as well. One of the things he referenced was the need to militarize the US's southern border. Okay, what are you talking about? He's talking about waging a war on immigration. And we've had very similar language from Keir Starmer recently, who's trying to, you know, out racist the far right on the question of immigration in Britain. Again, why? Why is there a renewed competition between all of the bourgeois politicians over who can be the most anti-immigrant? The reason is because it's desperately important for them at this time to make sure the masses are as divided as possible and distracted as possible from what's the real source of their problems, busy blaming other poor people while the rich are pushing all of them down and trying to work out how to get the maximum wealth off their backs.
You know, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about the Houthis is this. The big problem there, the huge problem, because let me just put it like this. The one thing that the term from the imperialist, peace through strength, implies is we can only have peace if we're stronger than everyone else so that we can dominate you. The imperialist actual claim should be peace through domination, right? What Yemen, what the Ansar Allah has demonstrated is we don't have to be stronger than you. We just got to be strong enough to give you a bloody nose, because you won't fight if you take a bloody nose. Because, and here's what the big problem with Ansar Allah, the huge problem, they're very, very poor. This is the problem. And what they showed was you don't have to be rich and powerful to do, and you don't have to be so powerful that you could defeat us in a land war and defeat us in an all-out war. You just have to be strong enough to give us a bloody nose, and we'll run away, because we don't want everybody else in the world to know how weak we are. And what they really did was demonstrated, because what does everyone say now in America? You know, a lot of people say, you in the anti-war community, you're really saying you want to go after Russia and China and you got your butts kicked by the Houthis? You're really saying you're going to fight Iran and you got your butts kicked by the Houthis? You know, that's a big discussion in the anti-war community, right? And so now I think if you're Iran, you know, they're not like, I keep saying, I don't think they're going to attack Iran after that. So that's the other part of it. They've North Korea, again, why is North Korea important? Venezuela, Cuba, they're not powerful, but they're willing to stand up. They're willing to absorb punches, and they're still around, and they're an example, and they will bloody, and now the Houthis have bloodied their nose. So the symbolic importance, if you would, about countries such as, again, Venezuela, Cuba, the Houthis, etc., who stand up against imperialism, even though they take a bloody nose, and every now and then, in the instance of the Houthis, they're willing to deliver a bloody nose.
You know, the Yemenis are a very interesting case, I think, because it's more than a symbolic victory, and it's more even than just the kind of classic asymmetric warfare of the kind of Maoist type that says when you have the masses on your side, and we saw it in Vietnam, when you have the masses on your side, you know, you might pay a terrible price, but ultimately you'll overcome. So Yemen is the classic case of that in many respects. They have the masses on their side. They've been fighting actually the combined might of Western imperialism. Certainly British and US imperialism have been in the driving seat of the war against Yemen for more than a decade now, I think. I have to get my dates.
Somewhere around, at least, yeah.
So they've been in the driving seat of that war, although they did it at arm's length in their classic modern manner and pretended it was some dispute with the Saudis. But in fact, it's been their war all along. And just because they're waging it by proxy doesn't mean they're not waging it seriously. Thrown huge amounts of armaments. They've done everything they could to strangle the population. They inflicted a strangulating famine on Yemen, just like the one the Israelis are inflicting on Gaza right now, but without the live streaming and publicity that made it hard to get away with. In fact, they were getting away with it. Every now and again, you'd have some hand-wringing commentator go on Radio 4 or, you know, whatever you have over there that's equivalent, would say, oh, you know, Yemen's suffering a massive famine and it's the poorest country on earth. And, you know, it would sort of present it as if it was some kind of natural disaster, you know, and as if it's something inherent to Yemen that they're very, very poor. Not that they've been impoverished by this systematic assault of imperialism. That they were, but the whole point of it was they refused to buckle. And not only that, but throughout that period, they were learning lessons. So not only were they doing things to try to develop their agriculture and industry and become more self-sufficient and taking lessons from all kinds of allies around the world, they learned about tunnel warfare and how to hide their munitions deep underground so that they can't be bombed into nothing and disarmed. But they also were extremely creative with new technologies. So the Yemenis have developed new types of drones for modern drone warfare, specifically aimed at repelling imperialist naval and air assaults, which is what they've suffered from. So they have these aircraft carriers coming to them and US Army ships. They have US bombers overflying them. They have Reaper drones and things overflying them constantly. They have been working out how to use old systems they had from the kind of Soviet era, you know, weapons that they got from other places, and they've been adapting them and modernizing them themselves. And they've developed new weapons. You know, if you've seen any of the footage of the Yemeni sea, you know, basically unmanned little boats, sea drones that they use to harass shipping in the Red Sea, it's been hugely effective. And they've built a whole load of those themselves. You know, that's their own homegrown technology. So they have actually found a way technologically in a classic Maoist asymmetrical way, but nevertheless, they have basically nullified the technological advantage of the USA and created their own technology that the USA at this moment doesn't have a response to. So this is a really, you know, a fascinating moment in history in terms of the development of arms. And, you know, the fact that the whole basis of US power on the globe was being able to project its air power anywhere on the back of floating airstrips, right? Aircraft carrier takes bombers anywhere you want them in the world, and no one anywhere you go has an answer to that kind of power. They can't do anything about this huge floating military city, you know, and all of the planes that are on it that can bomb your country into nothing. So this was the basis of US world supremacy, right? And now the Houthis, of all people, these, you know, poorest people on earth in their flip-flops and Kalashnikovs, have developed weapons that essentially nullify this incredible power. The USA hasn't been able to use that power. That's why Donald Trump started 6 weeks ago going, I'm going to smash and obliterate the Houthis. The reason it didn't happen before is Biden's weak. And then a little bit later he went, oh, those Yemenis are quite tough, you know. Anyway, they promised not to bomb us anymore, so it's all over, you know, and just stop talking about it, right? They couldn't do it. So for me, it's a really, it's a real sign of the times, Garland, that the technological supremacy, which is such an important part of imperialist domination of the globe, it has been broken and it continues to be broken. And you hear in speeches by Trump and by Hegseth and all these bully boys who are fronting up for US imperialism, there's constant assertions that we've got special powers that no one else has got. We've got a might that no one else can match. They're trying to tell people that the technological dominance has not been broken. But the truth is that it has. And, you know, back in the what they called the Cold War, which was never cold, but, you know, the war where the USA and the Soviet Union didn't directly fight one another, there was a recognition that there was essentially armaments parity, which is why you started to get agreements about, you know, cutting back on certain types of armaments, because it was getting a bit pointless because nobody really had the technological edge. So they weren't going to have a direct war against one another, and therefore we're spending a bit too much money on some of these things, aren't we? But as soon as the ability of the Soviet Union to be a peer power was broken, or temporarily broken at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and the disarmament of the Soviet Union, or the semi-disarmament of the Soviet Union. Luckily, it wasn't properly disarmed. The USA got it into its head that nobody else can ever catch up with us. And of course, they were wrong. But they shaped from that moment on their military policy, the way they procure things, the way they build things, the way they plan, the way they think about war, around this idea that from now on, we are just engaged in what they call policing operations. You know, we bomb people from the skies, and when it comes to occupations, it's either proxy forces or it's kind of it's relatively low level type of warfare. It's not peer competitor warfare. It's us with our amazing technology versus people with guns and flip-flops. Now, what's interesting is even with their amazing technology and their bombers where they have, supremacy of the air, and they have technology that the other side doesn't have, even in those situations, what we've seen is that the reality of a national liberation movement that is determined and has the people on its side still prevails, right? We still have the same problem that the USA faced in Vietnam. You had the same problem in Afghanistan. You had the same problem in Iraq. As soon as the USA puts boots on the ground, even when its technology is so much better, and even when it controls the skies and surveils everybody to death, it can't win. Just like Israel cannot beat the resistance in Gaza, despite all of the technology and the firepower on its side, despite all the death and destruction it wreaks. Literally all it's left with is trying to starve the population out of existence. It can't beat them militarily. It literally can't, despite everything it's got, and the whole of the West throwing weapons in at one plane load a day. It can't beat the resistance, even in this tiny little space. So this is the reality of the world that we live in, Garland. And I think that this is something that the USA is, they need war, and they need to win their war in order to save their system. But part of being able to wage those wars is being able to keep people believing that you're strong. And they're not strong. They're constantly looking for ways to get others to do the fighting. If you look at, so they've done this big shakedown in Europe, And now they've got all of the European imperialists jumping to attention and promising to spend much more on armaments. And why is that? Because despite all this talk about peace, the USA wants the Europeans to keep, and the Europeans want it themselves too, right? They want to keep the war against Russia simmering on some level, so they can come back to it later. They thought they would go Russia then China. It didn't work. So now they're trying to keep it going on a kind of low level, maybe get a conflict freeze like they got in Korea, right? But where they can keep pushing their armaments in, keep training proxy forces and restart it when they're ready. So they're demanding that the Western and European imperialists, ramp up their efforts on that front so they can pivot to Asia. This constant desire to pivot towards China. They need to bring down China, but they don't have the weaponry. They had to move one of their missile defense systems out of the China region and bring it into the Middle East to try and have a go at the Houthis in Iran, right? And every time they do that, they're undermining their own strategy. Just now, when Pete Hegseth gave that speech at the what's it called? What was the meeting they had?
I forgot what it was called, but it was some bringing together the Asian vassals to prep them to become Ukraine 2.0 is basically what it was.
Also, right? I want to say Shangri-La, but that's not right, is it?
Yeah. Might as well have been.
But so they have this. I mean, it's an annual get together, right? It's a regional event. But he used this opportunity to give his big speech, and one of the things he talked about was the excellent example our European allies are setting by ramping up their defense spending. And of course, there's two aspects to this. One is you agree to be our proxy army. The other one is you agree to buy all our weapons, right? It's one of the ways the USA is trying to keep the whole show on the road, is just massively ramping up defense spending and justifying it. But of course, the US defense spending, a lot of it ends up nowhere, right? You pay a huge amount of money for very little, but the part of the selling point is our technology is so brilliant and no one else can match it, right? And increasingly people around the world are like, but hang on a minute, that's not even true, is it? So the USA has to tie people in to systems, working to, what do they call it, integrated systems, whereby you have to have the same weapons as us because otherwise we can't integrate properly. And by the way, only Boeing makes it. We've got special technology that no one else can match. It's not really true, but we just want a monopoly on providing the weapons for all you people who've promised to spend more on arms. So there's a need to justify this ramping up of the war budget on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a desperate desire to use these munitions in such a way that will help the imperialists rebalance themselves from their crisis. So if you look at that summit that just happened, you see that the USA, and it's interesting to look at the map, because Pete Hegseth proclaimed that the USA is an Indo-Pacific nation. Total bloody nonsense, right? Okay, the USA has a coast on the Pacific, but if you look at a picture of the globe and you center it on the Pacific, it's like it's the whole world. Right? So the USA is over here, and the Asian Pacific nations are over here, and in between them is half of the world, just made up of sea. So it might be, the same ocean, but they're a world away from one another. There is absolutely no reason for the USA to claim it has a right to be involved in what goes on between neighbors over here. It's not one of their neighbors because it has happens to have a coast on the same ocean, when that ocean is the size of half of the planet, right? So it claims itself to be an Indo-Pacific nation, and this is how it does its narrative control of why I'm involved in this business over here. But who are the people it's trying to use as its proxies? It's trying to use India, Japan, the Philippines is a total proxy at this point. Taiwan is a total proxy. South Korea is a total proxy. Australia is pretty much a total proxy, right? Or semi-proxy. But so you've got Australia,
Singapore, I think.
Yeah, right.
Little old Singapore.
So you've got Australia and Japan in the kind of imperialist level. Then you've got India, because it's a big nation and a BRICS nation, and has the ability to go either way. They're trying to bring it in on a slightly different level. And then it has these totally subjugated nations or regions like Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, where it's building up its proxy armies, where it's militarizing at an ever accelerating pace and conducting bigger and bigger, more and more frequent war exercises aimed at North Korea, aimed at Russia, aimed at China, but especially aimed at China, of course. And this crazy narrative about, keeping the peace, about, protecting China's neighbors from China. It's like everybody in that region the only people they need protection from is the USA. Right? And again, you have this upside down framing. If the USA just got out of there, there'd be no problems in the South China Sea that the people there couldn't resolve amongst themselves. It's the same with, Eastern Europe. If the USA just got out of there, there'd be no, if they just disbanded NATO, right, there'd be no problems that people can't just resolve peacefully amongst themselves. So this narrative manipulation is something we need to be really aware of and alert people to what's going on. I think one of the key messages we need to get to working people right now is the same people who are benefiting from and hoping to profit out of Israel's genocide in Gaza, the same people who back that, who arm it, who fund it, are the same people who are profiting from the poverty crisis that's affecting your children at home. And these things are related to one another. And we have to help workers at home see that their enemies are not other poor people. They're not other victims of the system. That we are on the same side with the migrants and refugees who've been forced from their homes because of imperialism. We're on the same side as the people under US and British bombs in Gaza. We have the same enemy. And if we work together, that enemy is not as strong as it looks. If we let ourselves be divided and bought off and set against one another and distracted and confused, then there's a chance for the imperialists to try to stabilize themselves and stay on top. But it's at our expense. It's with our blood, it's with our sweat, it's with our children's future that they do that. But if we recognize we're fighting the same fight and fight together, then the imperialist system is in a massive crisis and it's ripe. It's ripe to be overthrown. But it takes work and organization to do that. And the first thing is recognizing that that's your job. You can't do a job you haven't set yourself, right? But if we set ourselves that task, there's a unique opportunity in history because you've never seen imperialism look so weak as it does today, actually, underneath all of its bluster.
I would agree with you. It's weak on every level because even they're saying, okay, we're going to go to fight. We've got to fight. But as the Houthis and others have demonstrated, and Ukraine, your weapons are inferior, right? Oh, we've got to fight. But as has been shown in Ukraine, you don't have the industrial base for a war. Right? Oh, Europe, you have to buy all of our weapons that don't work, that are overpriced, that we can't even produce. If you pay them for, if they were to say to the U.S., all right, we want $50 billion, $500 billion, $1 trillion worth of weapons. The U.S. industrial capacity is not that. They'd have to say, well, we can't even really produce enough to restock our own shelves. We'll give them to you. It looks like you're 22 years out. So the contradictions are so expansive now that it appears that you almost don't have to defeat them. They're collapsing. They're pretty good at defeating. They're collapsing on their own merit. Let me ask you this. And I do want to bring this in. Africa. Here's why I want to bring this in. If you look, there's another connection, and that is Germany, the Congo and its African, the rape and pillage of Africa. France, rape and pillage of Africa. Europe, the UK, I don't even have to get into that, right? Isn't it interesting that these are the three countries that every time there's a world war, which if you really look at it, it's just one constant world war that these people do. It just has hot and cold phases, right? But that these are the three countries that they survive off of the theft from Africa. And that what we're seeing now simultaneously with the weakening of these three countries, the louder shrieks for war, right? The economic and military weakening, the louder shrieks for war as they lose Africa. And simultaneously, again, I have to bring them up, as Ibrahim Traore starts to rise, and there'll be other Ibrahim Traores, and Africa starts to see the opportunity to pull away. But that connection of those three, I think, countries to the pillaging of Africa can't be overlooked.
Absolutely not. You know, right back at the turn of the 20th century, I think it was Cecil Rhodes, the guy who Rhodesia, that became Zimbabwe, was named after, went to a meeting of angry workers in the East End of London and reported back that the cries were for bread and that the people were angry and desperate. And he said, if we are going to avoid revolution, we need to be imperialists, i.e. the only way to pay these people off is to be looting the globe. And then we'll have a bit that we can throw to them, and then we'll be able to buy social peace. This has always been the way that the capitalist economy, once it became too big for its own borders, once it had impoverished its own workers to the extent that the markets could no longer expand through internal activity alone, they had to expand across the globe. This is how imperialism's always worked. They bought social peace. The rulers, the finance capitalists of the imperialist powers, the old powers of Europe initially, they bought peace at home by super exploiting the workers of the world and paying a little bribe to their own people to make them feel like, you know, they weren't quite so desperate as they had been before. Because capitalism creates massive polarization of wealth. It creates a few people who are incredibly rich, and it creates a huge number of people who are getting poorer by the day. And that massive impoverishment, of course, creates revolutionary sentiments and situations. And the revolutionary situations are also brought about by the crisis of overproduction of the system, whereby they are producing at a rate that they cannot sell the goods they produce because the people who they need to buy them are too poor to buy them. And this is an inbuilt flaw of capitalist production. And the only way out of it is to expand. And when the whole world is in the same crisis, where do you expand to? You've got to expand at somebody's expense. That's what World War I was about, fighting over who was going to get territories off of whom, right? Who was going to get the share of the world's loot, and trying to expand your markets at the expense of a competitor. Today, the big competitor really to the imperialists, although they also compete amongst themselves, but the big competitor is the socialist and anti-imperialist sovereign bloc of countries, which to different extents exclude the domination of the imperialist powers, exclude them from just ransacking their countries and super exploiting their peoples as they see fit. So this is the situation that they're in. Sorry, I'm just coming back. Yes, so this is just, I'm just giving this background to understand. This is why Lenin, all the way back before World War I, made it really clear that if you're a socialist, and the only way out of all of this insanity is socialism, right? The working people will become the ruling class. They will take hold of all the means of productions, the land, the seas, the air, and the factories, and they will use them to run a planned economy where we produce what we need and everybody has enough, right? And you raise the standard of living of all of the people together rather than a few while the rest are going down. So that's what a planned economy is. That's what socialism is. Socialism is what we need to escape the insanity of what capitalist crisis produces, which is war and poverty. But Lenin made it clear that you can only win socialism in the advanced capitalist countries, that's the imperialist countries, if you understand that the strength of your ruling class comes from how much it's able to enrich itself off the backs of the people abroad. So you need to understand that your struggle is the same struggle as their struggle, and you need to work together against your common enemy. You must not let yourself be divided from the people your rulers oppress abroad. You must not let yourself be confused by the, as my comrade used to say, shared whiteness of the skin, shared culture, shared nationality, whatever it is that they try to bamboozle you with. The ruling class in Britain is the enemy of British workers. It's also the enemy and oppressor of workers all over the globe. And those people who are struggling to get themselves free are on our side, and materially on our side, as you've shown with the example of Africa. Because what happens? So let's just look at Francophone Africa, right? What happens when the Sahel kicks out the French occupiers and the French looters of its resources? What happens to France's ability to pay the bribe to its own workers for social peace? It's massively impacted. So you can say in the short term, life gets worse for French workers. Yes, a bit, but it was already getting worse. But what does that do? It gives a massive impetus to the movement for socialism. So if you're a socialist, if you're someone who understands that only socialism is going to get us out of all this insanity, this constant drowning of the world in blood and misery, then only socialism will do it. Then it's a really positive step that the people who are being oppressed by our ruling class abroad start to free themselves and loosen those bonds of oppression. They limit the ability of the ruling class to get rich off the backs of people abroad, in this case, Africa. That also limits their ability to bribe all of our leaders and bribe the mass of the population with little kind of breadcrumbs from their table to make us feel like, oh, we don't need a revolution, we're all right, really, we're surviving. So you see, there's a material impact. Our rulers become weaker because they are no longer able to loot Africa. That means we have a chance to get rid of them, right? So the Africans are doing us a massive favor. Equally, we have to return the favor, reciprocate. We have to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming to us as our ruling class gets weaker. We have to work harder and actually overthrow them, because it's only when they're properly overthrown at home that all the people who are struggling to get free and retain their freedom abroad are safe. Right? Because for as long as the imperialists have these aspirations, sit on all this money, they will never stop using their capital to try to undermine and overthrow every sovereign government anywhere in the world. They see any type of sovereignty as an abomination because it's in the direct way of their profit taking, and nothing is allowed to get in the way of profit taking in a world where profit is king.
One more thing here, and that is the issue at home of, we've still got the Bernie Sanders and this, so-called left running around and what's sad when I listen to like Bernie and AOC is they're saying the same things that they've always said, right? They're going on exact same things. They're going on and they're like, Medicare for all, everyone, no American should have to work, and I'm like, and the people that like once thought Bernie was a good idea, even they're like, oh, Bernie, please don't even do this anymore. Please don't sing the same song. For God's sake, you're supporting a genocide, right? We don't really want to hear this. But they seem to have a role that's playing out. And it seems to me their role is to do this. Their role is to contextualize the problems of the working class, right? Through the lens of the ruling elite's vision. Here's what I mean. To say, look, you need to get a fair piece of the pie, and I put it like this before. Let's say the budget is $1 trillion. The working class needs to get 25% of that into there, and they can do the rest with what they want. They can give it to the Pentagon, they can CIA, do all the dirty things they do to go around the world. But as long as the working class gets their 25% of that, we're good, right? It is to ignore how the pie was baked, right? Hey, how did we get that money, by the way? Shh. We're not going to talk about imperialism, the rape and pillage of the world, none of that. We're just going to say the rule, it's to create this vision, understanding of the responsibility of the left, right, in the imperialist countries. What is my responsibility? Is my responsibility to say morally, I don't think it's right for my government to go around killing people, starting wars and stealing all their stuff? No, you're just supposed to say that however they get the money, your father is a mafia don, a mafia figure. He does crime, and ignore that. Your job is to make sure that the kids are well taken care of and that everything happens and the grass is cut and things like that. We got to ignore how dad makes his money, right? And that seems to be the message of the Bernie Sanders and his ilk, to go right back to, if we just had Medicare for all, if we just had a good healthcare system, if we just had a good social safety net, we could ignore all of this stuff going on around the world that our government's doing. It seems to be that's the left they want to create, and it's not working because one of the reasons is because the pain is so bad to the working class. Anyway, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, Garland. What you're describing is the whole system of social democracy, which has been in place since World War I, when most of the socialist parties of Europe betrayed socialism, essentially, during World War I. They sold out. They said they took the side of their own imperialists during the war. And it was only the Bolsheviks and one or two others who stuck to the agreement that they'd all made before the war, which was that if a war breaks out, it's an imperialist war, and the workers must not cooperate with it. They must turn their guns against their own exploiters and make a socialist revolution. Well, that's precisely what the Bolsheviks did put into action. That's why we got the October Revolution. But the rest of the socialist parties of Europe, the main leaderships of all those parties and the majority bulk of those parties sided with imperialism because they'd already really been bought off. As we talked about earlier. And what you had then was a split off. The revolutionary wings of those parties split off and formed the communist movement at that time, which allied with the Soviet Union. But so we've had this systematic use of social democracy, which is a phenomenon where you talk a bit socialist, you talk like you're the friend of the worker, but in reality, you confine yourself to totally bourgeois politics. Within the system of capitalism, you basically work to tie the labor movement to the imperialist system and tell people, well, this is how you get your benefits. We need the imperialists to be strong because that's how we get paid. They don't always say it as openly as that, but that's really the logic of everything that they say and that they do. And interestingly, they are definitely, as the crisis gets deeper and as more and more people feel repelled by the traditional camp of social democracy, they are trying to find a way to revive the ability of the Labour Party in Britain and the Democrats in the USA to keep their control over organised labour. Organised labour has huge potential if it's actually run in the interests of working class people. Now, the reality is for almost the entirety of the 20th century in the West, it hasn't been run in the interests of working class people. It has mass working class membership. It even has working class leadership, but those working class leaders have been thoroughly bought off and co-opted, and their agenda is serving imperialism. And so we have this real problem where, for example, and you've seen the same thing, I'm sure you've got lots of examples in America, during the Iraq War, we had the Labour Party running the war and the Labour Party running the anti-war movement, right? And we continue to have this same problem. The Labour Party is in charge of deindustrializing Britain and the Labour Party is running the industries, the trade unions that pretend to be defending the rights of the people who work in those industries. And lo and behold, the ruling class agenda wins out every single time. Why would it not? All our movements, anti-austerity, anti-war, trade union movements, all our mass movements are controlled by people who are controlled by our class enemies, right? So until we have a mass grassroots movement to kick these people out and to bring these organizations in line with actual working class interests, as opposed to being tied to imperialism through, several intermediary stages. In Britain, the main culprit is the Labour Party. We're stuffed. But what you have a lot of when people start to get really angry with the Labour Party, you have two phenomena. One is trying to get more people behind right-wing demagoguery. So you have Trump there, we have Nigel Farage and Reform screaming about immigration and trying to tell workers that it's other workers are the cause of their problem. And then on the other side, for the people that doesn't work with, there's constant attempts to reinvent social democracy from the left. So just as you've got a new Bernie movement, you'd think the Bernie movement was old enough by now and people have seen what he really represents enough times, right? But there's a lot of money to be spent in constantly boosting, and he'll get lots of press coverage and a lot of kind of fake lefties like in the Trotskyite and revisionist movements will all flock to the banner and assure everybody through all their press that, you know, this is the new hope for working people. We have the same. Jeremy Corbyn is being puffed up again as being about to start a new organization. And the attempt is to persuade workers that all you need is a new old Labour Party and everything will be fine. And don't look at what the old Labour Party actually was. We just need a new one like what it used to be like. But it was always criminal. It was always imperialist. Right from the get-go, the British Labour Party was an imperialist party. It right in 1900 rejected any socialist phrasing or aims in its constitution right from the beginning. Right, was never a socialist party. Right, not some other social democratic parties in Western Europe began as proper Marxist parties, but the Labour Party didn't. That's kind of why it's been the leader of world social democracy. It never had any of that kind of hangover of Marxism. But so you have this attempt to recreate from the left the old social democratic movement to just keep people busy. And, you know, it's this hoping for two things, hoping for a savior that's just going to fix things and we won't have to really organize ourselves for a genuine societal change and economic change. The other one is, you know, it's tied to the savior complex, is this desperate desire that the change we need can be delivered within the system. As you said earlier, you know, don't think about what the system is or how it works or why it's not even capable of delivering the things that we're fighting for. Just close your eyes to all of that and keep making your blind demands that, you know, it's not fair. We need a bit more of the pie, and we won't ask how you make the pie if you just give us a bit more of the bloody pie. But it's confine your vision within the confines of the capitalist system, which means in the West, of course, within the confines of imperialism, with everything that means, with all of the blood that comes with. We will look the other way if you just give us a bit more of your pie. That's fundamentally what all of this messaging actually means. It doesn't matter how many times the people at front stand up and even, you know, if it's Jeremy Corbyn, he'll denounce the genocide and say how awful it was, you know, but what he won't do is explain that the genocide is happening not because there's something weird about Israel, but because this is how imperialism deals with populations that won't go away any other way. And this is imperialism trying to keep its tool, Israel, going in a region that it doesn't want to let go of control over. And Israel is a proxy for imperialism. And if you don't want this type of thing to happen, you've got to deal with the root cause, which is British and American imperialism. It's not some weird, you know, something about Benjamin Netanyahu that made this genocide happen. And this is not an aberration, just as the Nazi genocide of Jews and Soviets in World War II was not an aberration. If you look at the history of imperialism, it's one long bloody genocide hopping from continent to continent.
And I'll say one more thing I'll say, and that is that the Bernies and the Corbins of the world, right? Look, if I want to understand where you stand, I have to kind of put you under stress and then, you know, make you lay your hand on the table. And what's interesting is the way they both reacted when the system kind of stomped on them a little bit. Like the system came in and said, Jeremy, you're a, what do you think, guys? Anti-Semite? Will that work? Yeah. Jeremy, you're an anti-Semite. That's like, that'll work. Whatever. That's good. And Jeremy's like, well, you know, I guess I am. Yeah, I mean, what? Yeah, we do have anti-Semitism in this party. And yeah, okay, guys, anti-Semitism, that's what you're going to use to get me out. I'm in, right? Bernie, literally, they did that. They were doing the whole Russiagate crap. And they said, yes, we think that the Russians have chosen Bernie. And they were like, what do you think, Bernie? And Bernie says, Putin, better stop that. What? So they like try to discredit you with Russiagate. Now you have to know it's a hoax. And what do you say? Yeah, okay, it's good enough. That when they tried to just say, nah, it's almost like they said, hey, Jeremy, yeah, Bernie, cut it out. And they said to the system, okay. And by the way, we're going to use anti-Semitism and Russia something or other to shut you guys off. Okay, yeah, sounds good. And now they come back. And in a way, I feel like Bernie's doing this. In a way, and this is what's really bad. I feel like Bernie, to some extent, is talking to the elite because he knows the truth. That Bernie's saying to the elite, he's not just saying to us, we need Medicare for all and we need, the usual stuff. We need some more social democracy, right? He's not just saying that to us to pacify us. He's saying to the ruling elite, look, you've gone too far. I'm trying to protect the system. You know what I mean? You're going to have to give these people something or they're going to revolt on you. You're on the edge of revolution. Chill out. And even then, they're like, well, look, Bernie, you just keep saying that to pacify him. We ain't going to give it to him. I feel like Bernie is trying to save the system that doesn't have the sense to save itself. That there's that level from a Bernie and a Corbin. Even Corbin looking at a system collapsing instead of saying, I was right all along. And you guys are wrong. And then the key would have to be this. He would have to say to the people, he would have to talk to the people on behalf of the people, but he's still they're still using the system stuff. Like they're trying to say, people be pacified, system, you better give them a little something or they're going to kill you. He's like still trying to be the intermediary between the people and the system to save the people and all to save the system. And bottom line, they're still the same guy.
Totally. Jeremy Corbyn, and I think Bernie Sanders the same in the USA, his role in the Labour Party was always to be the constantly outvoted minority, right? He's there to make it look as if there's a reason why socialists can join the Labour Party. He pretends he's a socialist and he says nice things and he joins all the lefty causes and it becomes their little totem. But he's always going to be outvoted in every Labour Party meeting and every, he's the 1 out of 3 MPs who does that. He gets a good fat career out of it. That's his job. His job was to be the Labour placeman controlling all of the opposition movements. And that was what they trained him for. When he became leader of the Labour Party, it was kind of a bit of an accident and a bit chaotic. And he himself looked pretty surprised by how that happened. And as you said, every single time the media, the ruling class, made a concerted attack on him, he stepped back and apologized. He did not stand his ground. And the reality is, if he had stood his ground and stood up and said, you people are lying to me, the mass of working people would have respected him and stood behind him, and he'd have been in number 10. And that's actually true. His program the first time around when he was standing for election was very, very popular. And basically, the election was pretty much stolen from him by the activity of his own people, trying to undermine his chance of success. He definitely could have got in the next time if he'd have stuck his ground on Brexit, if he'd have stuck his ground against anti-Semitism charges. Instead, what did we see? We saw him doing the work of the Zionist lobby, or overseeing the work of the Zionist lobby. The biggest campaign against, the biggest witch hunt of anti-Zionists in the Labour Party happened while he was the leader. He presided over that. He green-lighted that to let the Zionist lobby rip inside the Labour Party and expel everybody they didn't like. Every member. Literally going through social media accounts of Labour Party members and hauling them up before disciplinaries and kicking them out of the party. This Zionist lobby was let rip under allegedly pro-Palestine Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. So what's that all about? They took their opportunity, but he green-lighted it. Absolutely. So this is the role that they play. You're absolutely right. And this whole thing of conceding constantly, admitting the propaganda points of the ruling class rather than facing them down and saying, you are being lied to. I'll just give you a very small example. My brother recently, he'd been arrested several times. And one of the times he was arrested, or maybe both times, the police decided, it's discretionary, they didn't have to do this, but they decided that they would inform his employers and the General Medical Council. So his hospital where he was employed, and the General Medical Council, which is the professional body which oversees doctors in Britain and says whether or not they're allowed to practice. So they were informed that Ranjit had been arrested on terrorism charges and hate crimes charges, right? So they're like, oh my God, this doctor's a terrorist anti-Semite. So they started an investigation, basically because they got lobbied by the police and by a Jewish medical association, which is basically a Zionist medical association in Britain. So the Zionist lobby and the police were putting pressure, and the GMC decided to have an investigation into my brother. And the first legal advice he got was from people who just do these type of routine tribunal stuff, and their advice to Ranjit was just apologize. And he's like, what are you talking about? He said, do you think this is going to go away if I just say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to be accidentally racist? No. He said, number one, I absolutely reject the charge of racism and supporting terrorism. This is not what I've been doing. But specifically, he was being hauled over the coals over anti-Semitism because of our pamphlet, right? Which the police themselves, it turns out, had read and decided was not anti-Semitic. And yet, nevertheless, he's still being pursued on this charge of anti-Semitic. And they're threatening to strike him off as a doctor. And the legal advice he's getting is just say sorry, which is exactly what Jeremy Corbyn did when the anti-Semitism thing came from me. Just apologize, just say sorry, you didn't mean it. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Did it stop there? Of course it didn't. You give one step, they come for two more. You give those two more, they come for three more. You keep going backwards till you've got nothing left. And Ranjit was like, not only do I reject these charges, but I have a good mind to sue myself for being charged with racism. It's outrageous. When I'm trying to stop a genocide, to be charged with racism is a disgusting thing. We are not gonna back down here. And ultimately, the GMC dropped their charges. We'd be happy to take this to a court case, Garland. We have the exact opposite approach of the Social Democrats who say sorry and retreat in the face of these bourgeois talking points. Our job is to use these opportunities to show people how they're being lied to and manipulated, and how these charges are totally hypocritical. To be charged with racism by the people who create racism and stir it up and use it to genocide whole populations and justify their genocides, and then you oppose that and you get charged by a racist police force of being a racist. I mean, you couldn't get more dystopian and lunatic than that, could you? But it's our job to expose that and show it up to people and not back down in the face of it because we just want the trouble to go away.
I'll just say this because I know we're out of time, but I'll end with this quick statement. It's always the same dynamic. It's the difference between Libya and North Korea. They say to Libya, drop your weapons and we'll be your friend. They drop their weapons, we'll crush you. They say to North Korea, drop your weapons and we'll be your friend. And North Korea says, yeah, we don't trust you, go away. And we're going to strengthen our weapons. And what do? Darn, we can't attack them. What? Because their weapons are too strong, right? So they'll say to you, look, you've been involved in racism and, Russian botry and all kinds of things like that and anti-Semitism. And if you say, no, I haven't, they say, look, all you got to do is apologize and this thing will go away. And if you apologize, they then take that and say, we have a signed admission right here where you apologize that you did it. And we're going to use that to fire you, to throw you in jail. Now we'll come with a second charge and we'll say, well, this is the second time. So clearly you have a history of it and it's terrorism. So we've got to throw you in jail, out of the country, all of the above. So it's the same exact scenario. We get you to back down. You can't back down because if you back down, you're essentially dropping your weapons and then you're naked and then boom, they're going to attack you. That's the same dynamic that they use internationally. They only have like one game, way to play the game, and that's the way they play it. So that's wonderful. Sounds like your brother's a man after, and your movements are people after my own heart. I'm a big believer in that. Never, ever go. If you're going to go down, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down fighting. I'm not going to go down on my knees begging for mercy from people who never show mercy. Yeah, that's not even an option. At any rate, thank you very much, Joti. Where can everybody find you online? And I think that's a great way for us to end our weekly talk. Where can people find you online?
100%, Garland, we're with you all the way there. So if you go to Telegram, you'll find my channel, Joti Brar, and you'll also find my party's channel, The Communists. We have a YouTube channel called Proletarian TV, and we have a website with fantastic analysis. I don't know which side it's on. called thecommunists.org. You can see the URL there. All kinds of news and analysis that you don't easily get elsewhere, through a Marxist perspective that gives you context that is missing everywhere else, and helps you actually make sense of what you're seeing, instead of just, trying to drum up your emotions and manipulate you. And we also have on our website an education program. And if you click on that, you can find introductory as well as deeper texts that will help, and videos and all kinds of different materials to help you start to get a basic understanding of what is this Marxism stuff that I go on about, and why is it so powerful, and why do you need it?
Thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it, everyone. As I always say, follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and Telegram and all that kind of stuff. If you want to donate, there's lots of ways there. And there is a P.O. box. So if you want to send a book or a letter or whatever you want, and you don't want to do it, not guaranteed that it won't be read by the CIA as it was there, just the same as everyone else. But if you would prefer to write something down, there's my P.O. box at the end of that. Thank you very much. Most importantly, this is the most important thing that you can do. Share this on all your social media platforms. We have 337 people right now, so that should be 337 likes and a minimum of 337 shares on Telegram and Facebook and YouTube and all that kind of stuff. Granted, they may try to tamp it down a little bit, but the more the merrier, right? Thank you very much, Joti, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, everybody. We're out.